congratulations, class of 2020. Every year we say, what an unforgettable year. But this year they actually mean it. And the reason you're unforgettable this year is because of all the things you didn't get to do, whether it was final exams or spring sports or prom. And the list could go on and on. One of the things you may have missed was a commencement speech. I've always wanted to do a commencement speech, and I'll probably never get asked to do one. And so I'm like, hey, this might be my chance. I'm just gonna go out in the backyard and we'll give a commencement speech. And I guess the reason why, and I guess I should say real quick, why that I don't represent any school district or specific school necessarily. I'm just a teacher and a coach who is concerned about the future of our young people in this country and in the world. But as a self-ordained anthropologist of my own culture, I am fascinated by the commencement speech phenomenon. It's sort of like the collective rite of passage into adulthood. It's one of the few rituals that we actually have in our culture that's collective and everybody goes through it. And then this year we didn't get to do that. And so I thought, hey, I really would like to take a shot at it. And so here goes. Going back to what is so fascinating to me about the commencement speech is that it really is the essence, it's the message essence of our culture. And Ellen DeGeneres gave a commencement speech in 2009, and she really kind of captured it, and I don't have the quote right in front of me, but she said something to the effect of, ask yourself who you are, and then everything will be okay. David Brooks has studied this topic, and he says it kind of comes down to a few things. It's follow your dreams, follow your passion, don't accept limits, ask yourself what you want, and you are great, and go prove to the world that you're great. And those are kind of those are sort of the messages that we get as when we grow up in this culture, from Disney to Pixar, whatever. That's really what the gospel of our culture is, that says here's how you have a good life. And really today, I guess I'm here to question that, because our educational system, well, first of all, before I go there, let's just say this. While in 1954, they did a survey, and they asked kids if they felt like they were great, excellent, unbelievably excellent people. 12% of kids in those days thought that they were great. They asked the same question in 1989, and almost 80% of the kids thought that they were great. And the irony there, and the tragedy of that, is that kids are saying that they feel great, and yet we see suicide almost doubling since 1981. So as kids feel greater and greater about themselves, supposedly, there is more and more desperation deaths through suicide, and we aren't even counting the amount of deaths in opioids and things like that later on in life. And so there is a crisis going on in this country, and I'm not sure that the cultural message is addressing it. And I would say, just real quickly though, about the whole self-esteem centeredness of our culture. It is important. Maslow's teach us that you do have to have physical safety and all these requirements. You have to have like food, shelter, clothing, belonging, and self-esteem before you're ever going to be self-actualized or reach your potential. And so it is important. And we'll spend a lot of our lives trying to prove that to ourselves, that we are great or that we are important. And then at some point in your life, you may realize, isn't there something more? And so this commencement speech really isn't about this whole thing, hey, go get it, follow your dreams and all of that. Yes, you need to form your identity, and that is, you're going to have some ego building things in there, and you're going to have to go out and prove yourself to yourself, and that's going to mean competition and all that stuff. But I'm saying, in the end of the day, whenever you come across it, whether you're in your 20s or your 80s, there may become a time where that's just not enough, and you're saying, isn't there something more? And so this is about that moment. When is it that isn't enough? My education tells me to question the stories that my culture advocates to me. Basically, our culture tells us that you got to impress, you got to get the house, you've got to get the job, you've got to get all of these things, a lot of times these toys, and then basically you'll have a deep and rich, meaningful life. And that is absolutely not what my education tells me at all. And we put a lot of kids in a bad way when we tell them this, because we say, go find yourself, and then there are a lot of naval introspection, and really it centers down onto this one thing: what do I want? And I used to think that if I told kids how to get to the good life, I'd just say, hey, ask yourself, what do you want, and then go get it. I don't know if it's that simple anymore, and I also actually am totally convinced it's not about what we want anymore. So let me explain. Let me tell you the story of one of the most amazing people in the history of our country, as a story, about this next side of life, the side of life that leads to meaningfulness and joy-filledness. And I'm not talking about religion here, okay? I'm talking about a real American hero. Her name is Frances Perkins. Now, Frances Perkins, her list of accomplishments, literally, if you watch videos on her, it'll take 20 minutes to list some of the things that she did with her life, but let me go into it, okay? Because this woman was amazing. Let me start with this, though. Because if you listen to all this and you think, oh, she was a rich person who had lots of influence and therefore, of course, she got all this done, perish the thought. She spent her whole life groveling economically to support her husband, who was put in a sanatorium, as well as her daughter, who both were bipolar and had to be institutionalized, and she had to go pay that, which was very expensive. She worked until she was 85. So if you think for a second that she was some sort of bourgeois sort of person who had everything taken care of, and now she could worry about the concerns of the world, that's not even close to what she was. But here's some of the things she got done with her life. Okay, she fire safety regulations. If you've seen a sprinkler system and an exit sign, or practiced any sort of evacuation drill, that's Frances Perkins. She also, by the way, exposed 111 sex trafficking rings in New York City. Any one of those two things would have been big, right? She's also the mother. She's the creator of Social Security, the largest program in our country's history that helps older people in their old age to be able to not have to work when they're not able to. She started welfare for the very poorest of the poor in our country. She started unemployment for people who got out of work. She ended child labor. She got a 40-hour minimum work week. She got a minimum wage, and she nearly got health care, universal health care. Did not get that, but she started the WPA, the CCC, which were put people to work in the greatest economic depression of our country's history, and built things like the Lincoln Tunnel, the bridge to the Florida Keys, the Golden Gate Bridge. The list can go on and on of what she got done in her life. And so let me put that out there, okay? That's what she did. Now, her story can really... Now, when she was in high school, she did not just like say, hey, I think I'm going to go work in fire safety. No, that's not how it worked. You see, Frances Perkins loved literature. But guess what? Her chemistry teacher in college said you ought to study chemistry. And you know what her line of reasoning was for Frances? Study it because it's hard. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. And so she majored in chemistry and physics, and she hated it. Now, what good is that? And I'm not advocating studying what you don't love. That's ridiculous. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying this. If you want to take on and have a resume like hers, and you want to have a deep, rich, meaningful, joy-filled life like Frances Perkins, then we have to engage in things that are difficult and are tough because they make us tough. So when you think, when Frances Perkins, when she was out of college, kind of wondering what she was doing, she was drinking tea on Washington Square in New York City. And a 10-story factory across the square erupted into flames. And she saw 47 people plunge themselves out of 10-story windows to avoid being burned. And her life's mission was formed right at that moment. Now, she didn't go around thinking she was going to be a fire safety regulator or anything like that for her life. She saw a clear need, something that very profoundly disturbed her, because she found out that the factory didn't have any precautions. A lot of these deaths were preventable. The fire escapes were there. They also shut the doors, trapping the women inside because they didn't want the fire to spread. This was a company that was completely unprepared to deal with this, and 146 people died in this called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City. I think it was in 1908 or something like that. I'm not sure of the exact year, but it was in that area. And the thing is that she didn't have political power. She didn't have money. She didn't have anything. You understand? But because she had practiced hardship, hard things, like studying things she didn't like, she threw herself into fighting these big businesses, and she had developed her character in such a way that she was ready to deal with all of the pushback that these billion-dollar industries were going to provide for her. Now, that would be amazing if that was enough, right? Like if she just did that, right? But here's another story about Frances Perkins. While she was investigating all of these dangers in the industry of New York City, she came across another one, another fire that was burning, that was all around her, but it was invisible. It was immigrant women would get off the boat in Ellis Island, and there would be a lot of guys who would tell these women, hey, you can stay at our hostel, our apartment complex for free until you get a job, and then you can pay us back. It seemed very reasonable. But the system was rigged. These women could never pay back the loan that they were being offered for these apartments, and they were forced into slavery, sex slavery, or sex trafficking and prostitution. So when Frances Perkins found this out, do you know what she did? Well, she did something. Do you know what she did with her money and power? She didn't have money and power. She pretended to be an immigrant woman, and she confronted 111 sex trafficking pimps. She could have been killed. But the sum total of Frances Perkins' life wasn't about what Frances wanted. It was about, hey, there's something screwed up in my community, and she threw herself into it. And she got to be known for getting things done. Like, who takes on 111 sex trafficking rings in their life and win? That in itself would have been enough right there to put her up on, But that's just getting started. People started to realize this woman's getting stuff done. She met Al Smith, who was running for president of the United States, who introduced her to FDR, who later became president, and she became the first female Secretary of Labor. She was actually the first female cabinet member in any presidency in the history of our country, and also she is widely considered, without really much any controversy, as the most influential cabinet member of all time in our country. So there's that. Now, she is an amazing woman. I want to tell you a couple things she had to endure to do this. One is she had to deal with men. Because she was in a male, the cabinet and the presidency and all of the White House was just full of men. And she had a notebook called The Male Mind. And one time she was on an elevator with a crude senator. And she realized, as she took notes on this guy and what his behavior was and his attitudes, was that men will tend to honor their mothers, but kind of put down pushy, sort of assertive, aggressive, not aggressive, but women who are ambitious. They kind of have problems. A lot of men have problems with ambitious women who are powerful and strong. And so she changed her persona. She started to wear black dresses with pearls and put her hair up in a bun so she would look motherly. In fact, the writing about her before this was she was described as perky, and after that she was kind of described as matronly. In other words, she changed her persona because she thought it would get stuff done. Now, let me say this very clearly. I in no way advocate that anybody should do this. She should have been herself. right? It's tragic that she felt she had to do this in order to be more influential among men. But it shows, though, that Frances Perkins was willing to do things she didn't want to do in order to get things done. And what kind of things did she get done? Well, she believed in things like Social Security and welfare and things that would help the average person. Nietzsche says that whoever knows their why can deal with any how. Frances Perkins knew her why. It was to help the world. It didn't really matter about her. But I want to talk about the art of her how. How did she do these things? And just I want to give a couple examples because they're so rich and they're so beautiful. One of the first examples was, well, another problem she found was women couldn't vote until 1920. She was born in 1880, so the first 40 years of her life, Frances Perkins couldn't vote. Oh, how do you think Frances Perkins felt about that? What do you think Frances Perkins did? Stay silent? Nope. She got up. Without her money, without her influence, without all these other things, she got a little box, we call it a soapbox today, and she stood on it. And she spoke her mind to the world about why women should vote. And she'd usually take a friend, and the friend would hold a sign saying, women should vote and stuff like that. And then she'd always do it by bars. And then the plan was that the guys would come out kind of drunk and hurl insults. Frances Perkins knew this was going to happen. She was like, whatever. Just like she knew being on an elevator with recruited senators was going to happen. But she figured out a way to make the most of everything. And she would look at the crowd of drunk men, and she would always find one guy who was kind of not comfortable with these guys hurling insults at these women. And then she'd wake her way through the crowd and ask this guy, hey, would you hold the sign? My friend has been holding the sign for a long time under the sun. We would really appreciate it. And they would. Why did Frances Perkins do this? This is genius. Because she knew that a woman fighting for women's issues wasn't going to gain as much traction as if men were also on board with this. And so she did that way. Another thing she did, and this is a beautiful example of her leadership style. One time she went to a tea party. She was not into parties, but she went because she had to. Her whole life was not about what she wanted. It was about what she thought was necessary to get things done. And so she went to a party at the Supreme Court Justice's house. And she got a chance to sit down with tea with this guy. And he was asking her how she's doing. And she said, well, I'm kind of struggling. I'm struggling with the constitutionality of Social Security. I'm not sure if it's constitutional or not, because she was getting a lot of feedback saying people didn't want their checks to be rationed so that they could save for retirement. What they said, that's infringing on my rights. And so she had teams of lawyers, some of the best lawyers in the United States, trying to figure out the constitutionality of Social Security, something we take for granted today. But she had to figure it out. And because she had asked this Supreme Court justice in such a humble, unassuming way, not dogmatic, not preachy, not ram it down your throat kind of stuff about how my ideas are right. She didn't do that. She just asked him a question. And he said, that's nothing. Just call it taxation. It's constitutionally, the government can tax its citizens. And so she just framed it as a tax program, and it has gone on until today, and it has helped millions of people. My parents are on it. So it's just beautiful. I love her story. You would think if you ever see a picture of Frances Perkins, you would think that she was a rule follower. But people who are, I don't know how to say it, people who become more and more high on Maslow's hierarchy learn the rules well so that they understand how to break them. Now, Frances Perkins didn't break the rules, right? She was the Labor Secretary of the United States. But in that time, immigration was involved in this. So, in other words, she was in control with who came into our country. Well, she had met Adolf Hitler in the mid-30s, and she knew right away that this guy's insane. He's going to hurt a lot of people. And so she kind of tweaked the visas and the immigration thing so that she could get tens of thousands of Germans into our country so that they could avoid the concentration camps of later. She was eventually one of those people that she helped in turned out to be supposedly a Soviet spy, which led to a trial for her impeachment in 1939. FDR left her out to dry, did not support her, and she proved it in her case. She fought for herself, by herself, alone, and she won it, and she was not impeached as labor secretary. And it's sad because she was stopped from smuggling in lots of Jews during that time in 1939. You know, if she'd been able to do it all the way up to 1945, think of how many lives she would have saved. But that was just an example of how she sort of used the system for the greatest good, for the greatest number of people. Now, when she was done with her career, she could have written a memoir and become very wealthy, but she instead wrote a book honoring FDR, and I think that just says so much. So, wrapping this up, a woman born in 1880, really, and we're talking about that in 2020 when we got George Floyd going, when we have got a pandemic going. I mean, wow, is this lady even slightly remotely irrelevant? Well, that's why I'm here. Because Francis shows us that if you want to have a meaningful, joy-filled life, it's not logical. If you want to be happy, you don't just seek happiness. If you want, getting what you want is not about getting everything you want. You don't get what you want by getting everything you want. That's what I wanted to say. I mean, we live in a nation, where it's still possible to get a lot of things you want. And Francis Perkins shows us that getting what you want isn't the end all be all toward a good life. Today, we are ravaged by a crisis of meaning, of purpose, of racism, of hatred, of division. And there has to be something else. I mean, if our response to this whole thing is, hey, what do you want? It's all about you. What do you want? I'm sorry, but the world's on fire. And if we learn anything from Frances Perkins, when she saw the world burning, she didn't have it all figured out. She didn't have the credentials. She didn't have the resources, the political clout, nothing. But she made stuff happen somehow. And in doing that, if you read about how she reflected on life, and she was very clear that her life was full of joy. She said that her cup runneth over, and surely goodness would follow her whole life. That's a quote from the Bible, but she lived that, and she never talked about herself. And so if that was the quote line that she said about herself near the end of her life, she probably meant that. She did not use many words, and nor did she speak a lot at meetings. And she would usually wait until she was asked a question to speak. And at other times, she would get her in her soapbox and go out there. And so she was a complicated woman. But she knew her purpose. And she said she did all of this for God, for FDR, her boss, and she did it for the plain, forgotten, common people of this country. It is a great example, and it is probably the nugget that we neglect to mention in school. The American dream that we've been preaching for the last 75 years has been centered on getting more and more. Frances Perkins, who lived the American dream as well as any, showed us that the true American dream and the pathway toward a meaningful, joy-filled life is not by asking, what can I get? It's by asking, what can I give?